Okay. I have to introduce myself a little bit. So I'm here today following up all of these people who are doctors and lawyers. And I'm none of those things. So what I like to say is that I am really probably the industry's most tenured generalist. I've got no letters after my name. I have 4 teenage girls, which gives me a lot of street credibility in general life. But in this, I've just been doing this for a long time. And so my goal for today is to not go through all of these slides because you'll get the deck. My goal is to do a translation for all of you in the room who don't have all those letters after your name, or they're not specifically in drug testing, right? So most of you have a job, and drug testing is a piece of it, meaning your HR, your safety, your something. I'm going to try and make this as simple and user-friendly as possible, right? It's like pulling out like your iPhone, and somebody's hopefully going to walk you through to make it easier, unless you're my mother, in which case it's still not super easy. But that's what we're going to go through today. And I'm going to go through stuff quickly. And I'll be outside later as well. And I'm doing a talk next with Frank Bernard, and so we're going to cover some of the same stuff. But the goal of this is twofold: that you come out of it with an understanding of drug testing policy that you can use, right? Because I'm not going to give you all the answers today. And that you also kind of take some of the information that you've got from all these other speakers and hopefully have it sink in for you about really what's coming with drug testing. So I mentioned that we're going to talk about drug testing. I want to talk first, for the first second, just about marijuana. I mentioned I have the 4 girls. They're my only job about should you or should you not smoke pot, right? All sorts of interesting conversations when your mother's the drug testing chick. They're my job. It isn't my job to tell you whether or not it's good, bad, or indifferent. It is not my job to ask you to raise your hands, because about 65% of you, if you had the guts, would raise your hand and say, I'm all right with it, right? I will tell you a 2-minute story about how this all came about. For 10 years ago, all of the people, I've been doing this for 26 years. I started right out of grade school and right into drug testing, just what you all hope to do with your life, right? And so when I did, 10 years ago, everybody, and I know a bunch of these people, right? A bunch of people said, there's no chance marijuana is going to go legal. Like, it's not. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Well, it's happening. We don't even have to discuss the details. It's happening, right? The horse is out of the gate. We're done. It's going to go there. The issue is right now, people, the confusion about how this is happening. If you pay attention, in 10 minutes you will understand why, as an employer, and as a taxpayer, this is likely to be the most expensive thing that employers have to deal with in the next 20 years. And I say that confidently, confidently. And part of the reason is because it's so complicated. Part of the reason is because the policies are so complicated. So if you stop and do nothing and just learn about drug testing laws, it's complicated. Again, I'm not a lawyer. There are mandatory, we're going to go through these in detail, but there are mandatory laws, and mandatory state drug testing laws are just like they sound. They're in 16 states, 2 cities, Boulder and San Francisco like to have their own little situations, 1 territory. Those are mandatory. That means every employer in that state has to abide by those laws. There's case law, California. California just has a bunch of different cases. And so as an employer, you got to make a decision. And I'm not kidding, like, I don't know this. I've got my team of consultants and they tell me, I'm like, what is the summary judgment again? I don't remember all these things. I just try and make it so that it sticks in your head. So what is case law? Case law means simply that there have been a bunch of cases decided because there aren't laws that tell you yes, no. And so as an employer, you've got to sort of sit there and say, so where do we fall? Like, what do we know? Do we know this case was so strongly decided that we should follow it? Or do we say, we don't really care how that one's decided, we're going to take that risk and that chance in our policy? And so there are 7 states with case laws, and you've got to look at multiple case laws to figure out where things sit. Then there are workers' comp and unemployment compensation laws, and people call it different things, right? But in those states, you can do different things. So if they're voluntary laws, so if you choose to abide by those laws, then you get some benefit out of it. And the benefit is generally this idea of limited liability or a discount. So the states that have workers' compensation premium discounts, you get a discount. If you have a big workers' compensation premium, it could be a big discount. And different states do different discounts, so we'll talk about that. Then there's industry-specific laws. We'll cut on some of the, we'll decide or talk about some of those, and some of you in the room fall under that category. And then there's medical and recreational marijuana laws. This is the Wild Wild West. And I'm not exaggerating. It's the Wild Wild West. So as we see this, it changes every day. My team follows this. You cannot literally keep up with it sometimes. We're going to go through some of the details, but again, my job's not to tell you the details of all of this because you couldn't learn it this quickly. My job is to give you a sense of what you've got to do when you go back home. So when you talk about mandatory drug testing laws, and I'm trying to make this as interesting as possible because it's drug testing and it's laws. It can be about anything. There are no rules about what a mandatory drug testing law has to cover. So some of them say specifically, this is the panel you have to have. Some of them say specifically you have to use an MRO. Some say you can't use a point of care test or an instant test. Others say you can. Some say you can do hair testing, can't do oral fluid testing. Others don't mention it at all. Some say you have to do education and training. Others don't. Some say super specifically, if you're going to do education in this state, it's mandatory. You have to say A, B, C, and D, and you have to give that policy to your people 60 days in advance, or else you are not complying with the mandatory state law. You've got to know what each one is, and you've got to know what state you're doing business in, where your employees come from. If you're doing contracted labor, temporary labor, you've got to understand all of those nuances of all of those laws. You cannot have a random little template policy that you got off of LegalZoom somewhere. It's not going to work, right? It's not going to work. So you've got to know all of those different things. And then you've also got to know if the law talks about employment actions that you can take, and any other details, because some of them say you have to have an EAP. Some of them say if you test somebody, they have the right to go back. You can't terminate them, and then you have to put them through an EAP, even if they're not an employee, they're a candidate. And so again, you've got to make a decision. Well, are you going to drug test in that state or not? And that's not always a popular thing for me to say as the drug testing lady, but it's the truth, right? There are states where you have to think, is there a value, given all of the expense that I have to do? Thankfully, these are tiny little states, but given all the things that I have to do to have a drug testing policy, how do I get my return on investment to do that, given the mandatory state laws? When you get into case law, this is where we're going to start to talk about how complicated life is getting because of marijuana. Case law has a lot of interesting things, and they're deciding what you can and can't do. So in California, for instance, there's cases that really say, you probably shouldn't be doing random testing in general in California, right? It's a case law. It's not an actual law. It's just how a case was decided. These laws are where marijuana is starting to get interesting for employers, because when employers come to us, and we work with DISA, we've worked with DISA for years, and we talk about policy more than I ever thought I would. These cases are starting to make it very confusing for employers. If you ask me, can I write you a policy so that you cannot get sued? The answer is no. You can get sued for anything, right? Can I write you a policy now where 10 years ago I would have said, just put in your policy that marijuana is a Schedule I drug and you're following the federal regulations? Yeah, you can't. You're probably not going to stand by that too much longer. And these are the reasons why. So this case, I'm not going to go into in crazy detail, but in this case, basically what happened is the plaintiff was offered a position. The person said, I have a medical marijuana card. You can read the details here, right? They rescinded the job offer. In 2017, the state came in and said, well, yes, she's allowed to sue, right? Again, I'm making this in super easy ways, right? She's allowed to come in and sue for this. So they said, we can. In 2018, there was a summary judgment. Again, that's why I go back to my team and I have to remind me what that is. But basically what they came in and said, we're siding with her. We're siding with her. And so we are seeing more and more cases where in this case the employer said, we are trying to abide by the Federal Drug-Free Workplace Act, and the judge said, guess what? It doesn't say you have to drug test in that. You just lost. And so you need to be aware of what's coming, what's happening. You need to read these things. You need to read into them. You need to understand what the impact of them are going to be when you look at different case laws. Because as we see these things happening, and again, you can be sued for anything, right? And so the different flavors of the cases that are being decided are very different as well. So this is a new one as an employer that you may or may not be thinking of when people are talking about the cost of drug testing or the cost of marijuana in the US, right? The costs are things like this. Now you got to pay for it. You've got to fund it through your workers' comp. In this case, now we hadn't seen that before. So as you're thinking about, like I said in the very beginning of this, I can convince you it's going to be super expensive to all of us, right? Stop believing the hype that all that tax revenue is going to be fabulous. These are the things that as employers you're going to have to start dealing with. And the last time I checked, the guys who are distributing, growing, packaging, selling, they don't have any employer fund for you guys to pay for this. So you're going to pay for it all by yourselves, right? And I'm pretty sure you're also not going to go to the tax people in your town and say, hey, wait a second, all of a sudden I got all this new stuff, like all these workers' comp claims, I got to pay them and now my rates are going up. They're probably not going to write you a check. So maybe I'm wrong, I don't think so. So what are the workers' comp laws, right? So when you go back to skipping marijuana, just the workers' compensation laws, they are simply varied laws that say in this state you can have a discount to your workers' compensation premium. Florida's one, right? You can have a discount. Follow the rules, and the rules vary. So it might say you have to educate employees. It may say you have to drug test. It may not say you have to drug test. But if you abide by it and you go through your workers' compensation premium or your carrier, they will give you a discount for following the rules, and it can be substantial. You have to follow the law. If you choose, right? And again, this is why you can't just have a generic policy. You've got to understand if you're going to do that or not, and does it benefit your company to abide by the workers' compensation premium discounts? What's it going to cost you to do it based on the rules? And then based on the rules, what are you going to save when you get that discount? The others are easier, right? A denial of workers' comp or a denial of unemployment. If you deny one workers' compensation claim because of a positive drug test, it could pay for your entire drug testing program for the entire year. So you've got to look at them, you've got to know what they require of you as an employer, and you've got to include them in your policy. You can't just find out about it and then say, that's fabulous. You've got to figure out what the details are. And again, the details vary. Do I have to have an MRO? Do I not? Do I have to do education? Do I have to have training? Do I have to have a thing on my wall that says what I do? Do I have to give you a policy in advance? Am I allowed to terminate you? All of those things can vary by state. A sample, Indiana home health care has a specific law. They say a confirmatory test is required. Pre-employment reasonable suspicion or random testing is required. Right? And it's required for all home health care employees. Illinois has a public works. So POCT, which is really, instant testing technology, that's prohibited. You have to have an MRO. It's mentioned but not required. So some of these, even when they do detail the rules, kind of talk about it, but they don't require it. So you've got to look in depth at each of the different rules that you've got to abide by the industry-specific laws and find out what they are. And they only apply to you if you have that industry in that state. When we talk about medical and recreational marijuana, this is just a sample of some of the activity we've seen just this year. And I actually talked to someone in the room about Oklahoma. They're making it very difficult. So again, as you see these things come up in your state, I want you to notice a couple different trends. It is rarely a once and done, right? So as the law is proposed, sometimes they propose one. Sometimes there's proposals for 3 or 4 different laws with different nuances with the hope that one will pass. Sometimes there's one, and then if it gets defeated the first time, they take and change the nuance to that. and then it passes. What is rarely happening right now, and I'm an employer, so I get to put myself in the bucket, is that employers are not being active, right? I went years and years and years ago to a 7-day retreat in Lansdowne, Virginia. It was really good. They had really nice snacks during the whole training. So I came out with two things. They had super good snacks. And there was this like bucket thing that you could put stuff in, and it said, you know, important and urgent, important but not urgent, urgent but not important. It was these 4 little quadrants. And I walked away and I remembered that and remembered it for all these years with the snacks. This is likely going to be super important when you walk out this door. You're going to be thinking a whole lot about it. Then you're going to go back to your desk and there's going to be 1,000 fires to put out, 400 emails that you got today because everybody ignored you out of office. And you're going to have so much to do that it's going to fall back into that important but not urgent bucket until what happens? Until you get sick. And then you're going to it's put on my to-do list. It's put on my to-do list since I went to that thing. At that hotel, I had pretty good snacks and it was a little cold. But that's what's going to happen. So you've got to be active. You've got to be paying attention. You've got to get the short list, right? DISA publishes this information. Get the short list. What does it mean? What do I do with it? How am I going to affect it? And be active. Because the people who want this to be legal are super active. And it's going to cost you money and it's going to make them money. So now we've finished sort of the general overview that hopefully something will stick, right? We're going to learn a lot of stuff today. Something of that will stick. Then we're going to talk about the DOT, and people are going to say, well, I don't have DOT, or I do have DOT, and I know the rules. There's actually a way that although DOT, HHS, and SAMHSA don't get a say in state drug testing laws, the reverse actually happens. So in 20 states, and there's samples, these are very wordy slides. It's all there because you're going to get to see them later. There are samples of it. But there is an impact to state laws because the states often referenced the DOT, HHS, or SAMHSA in their laws. So they took the easy way out, in a sense, and said, okay, if you have a mandatory law in Montana, this is what you have to do. You have to have the DOT panel. So when that DOT panel changed in January, all of you probably are aware of that, right? When it changed in January, did you look to find out if the 20 states that reference the DOT laws, or the DOT regulations, what did it change in those 20 states? You should have looked at your policy and updated it, because 20 of them reference something. And again, it could be an up to and including, it could be a sort of kind of, right? So it could say you have to do the same drugs as in the DOT panel. Or it could say you have to do that as a minimum, but you're allowed to add on as well. It could say you have to have an MRO, but you have to know because the impact to these laws is different. And by the way, they use the words interchangeably. DOT, HHS, and SAMHSA are like all thrown in there interchangeably. So some of them say one thing, some of them say the other and reference it. So you have to understand how all of that then affects. And by the way, it's about to change again, right? So we're about to find DOT changes by the end of this year. They'll probably implement, I don't know, 18 months or so. So you've got to really be prepared and you've got to be thinking about it. And there will be impact. And again, I'm not going to tell you what it's going to cost you to do anything, but there's impact. When a policy, and you know, you can't blame the providers, right? When it changes, when you add drugs to your panels, the MROs are going to get more reversals. The labs have to test for more drugs. They have to print new chain of custodies if you're not using electronic chain of custody. There's got to be changes across the board, and so there will be impact to you. And so if you are the person in charge, whatever you are, safety, HR, whoever you are, then you should also be watching all of these things to know, right? In my head right now, I'm not sure what it's going to be, but I know in 2019 my budget's going to change, and it's not just going to be my budget because I'm getting more people, more higher, right? Higher turnaround or higher turnover. It's going to be because there's probably going to be an uptick to something because the regs are going to change. And by the way, if you were in here for Donna Smith earlier, you also know that there's a high probability that the random rates are going to go up because we're seeing all these additional positives. And so you got to be thinking about that. I don't do this from like the philosophical perspective. I do this from the, you know, sit down and do your homework because it's going to hit your budget. And you always want to look at your boss, so be prepared to know what that impact's going to be. So then I go to this idea. So somebody had on one of their slides that employers are saying, stop, you know, so all of this is very complicated. And so in the states that I have to test, I'll test. But generally speaking, I'm thinking I should stop testing. And although I have tons of slides here, right, tons of slides here on all of the reasons why, I'm going to run through them quickly and I'm going to tell you, you should continue to test. And again, I don't do drug testing, actually. I'm just the drug testing chick. I don't do the actual testing. So it doesn't affect me necessarily, but it will affect you. Couple different things. Whether we go recreational or marijuana with recreational or medicinal for marijuana, there's a cost involved. Some of these things are what they call like the soft cost, the indirect cost, but again, take a piece of paper when you get this slide deck and start to do the different math of what the cost is. Alcohol is legal. I like alcohol. It's legal. It costs employers billions of dollars a year. 70% of the cost burden for alcohol being legal in the United States is borne by employers. Absenteeism, right? We're going to go through those different things. Employers sponsoring things like rehabilitation programs, employee assistance programs, back on track programs, super smart way to go. Again, it is not a cut and dry policy. You need to be thinking about the things like the technology that's available. You need to be thinking about the laws. You need to be thinking about drug disclosure laws. And you need to be writing all of those things in your policy and really making some informed decisions about why you're doing drug testing in the first place. And if you're gonna spend the money, you might as well do it to make it super effective in your workplace. And at 4% unemployment rate or whatever it is right now, right? You want to look at retaining employees, you want to look at the cost of turnover for employees, you want to look at safety, all the savings you can do, and some of the things are changing, right? So this is like probably the most change we've seen in all these years since I started this. The most change is happening now, and as employers, you've got to be thinking about retaining talent, and that may mean that you look back and start to say, well, maybe we can't anymore say, if you test positive for us, you can't come back and we won't rehire you for a year. Or if you test positive, then we're going to terminate you. You might have to start thinking about other programs because it took you 6 months to train that person who took that highly technical job. And just because they had an issue, are you going to make a termination decision and make that the end of it? Or are you going to look at, can they be accommodated in a different position for a time? And then can you do an advanced testing program or a back on track program? But you got to have it in your policy, right? So you've got to be thinking about all those different things. And those programs, just like on a society, human being perspective, highly successful. Employer-sponsored rehabilitation programs and testing programs are way more effective than if you just pay through your health insurance, which you're paying for, and are going to increase your costs, right? If you just pay for them to go for their 28-day inpatient treatment program for $40K, and by the way, there's a lot more people going into those now, and then you just say, okay, you're out or you're coming back, then you're likely going to see the cost, but you're not going to see the benefit of retaining somebody who could be a very qualified employee. And if you sponsor their rehabilitation and their continued follow-up testing, they're likely to be much more successful. So what are the consequences? You guys know these because they kind of work in your head, right? This is marijuana, this is alcohol, this is drug use. What are the things that cost money? Some of these are easy to put money towards or to put dollar signs on. Some of them are not. If you're in HR, you can track these. If you have an insurance carrier that you work with, you should be saying to the insurance carrier, hey, could you give me these numbers? I want to start to track them and I want to see what the difference is. Some of them are easy, right? If you've got a lawsuit against you, then you're going to know how much you pay your lawyer because they're fighting about something about a drug or a drug test, or because they were injured, right? These are some of the costs. You can do the math. It's not very hard to do the math. By the way, all of these statistics, we have some that we do at CCG. Some of these, they're readily available. You can ask DISA, we can get you them, right? Some of the statistics are so old compared to the laws changing. So I think there's a slide in this deck when I get to it that shows Colorado and the increase in accidents, or the increase in workers' comp claims in Colorado. The latest data we have is from 2012, which was the year recreationally it became legal. We don't have the data that shows now what the dollars are like. If you're doing business in Colorado or in any state where it's legal, I highly suggest you get that information from your workers' comp carrier. Oh, there it is. Right? Get your information from your workers' comp carrier. Find out what it is. Right? When you're looking at your health insurance, don't ask for specific information on who's in rehab, what did they do, what's wrong. See how many people you're sending into that. Remember that some of the soft costs that people don't think about, you guys, are the cost not of Nina has a drug problem, right? It's not Nina has a drug problem. It's Nina's, whatever, a kid, knock on wood, right? But that was like the Irish in me, knock on wood. It's somebody in my family, and that has impact. And those are the numbers that are so hard for you to put down on a piece of paper in an Excel spreadsheet and say, like, this is costing me money. I don't think she has a drug problem, but because we're kind of our head in the sand and we're just doing our business and we're dealing with urgent and not important, we're not paying attention that she's absent all the time and her work quality is declined and she's on her cell phone all the time, and it's because she's got a husband, a spouse, a daughter, a son in rehab. Oh, a son. I don't have any sons. I'll talk about my son in rehab, right? So there are impacts that are even softer than some of these, and you've got to know. This I'm going to put together. I had to make notes because I can't remember anymore. We played with numbers. This is how simple this is. We got data from the Guide to Employer Lawsuits in 2017. There's 18.1 roughly million employers who have under 100 employees in the United States. Those of you who have more than 100 employees, those of you who start to go beyond that 1,000, you know what you have? You have deeper pockets than this. So keep that in mind. This is the little ones. If 1 in 100 have a case for medical marijuana, right? Or for marijuana, to challenge all of this confusion, if 1 in 100 have a case, they would have 181,740 court cases. The average out-of-court case cost is $90,000 after insurance if it's out of court, right? If you go to court because of it, so you don't settle basically, it is $165,000 on average. Not my numbers. I don't know how they got them, but it seemed pretty credible. If you take that and you assume each employer had 1 settle and 1 in court of those 1%, so we're talking infinitesimal amounts of actual cases, then the cost alone will be $231.7 billion in 5 years to settle just medical litigation, and that's just the small guys. Generally, they come after the small guys way later. So again, why am I telling you all this? You've got to be active, right? You've got to be active. You've got to be looking at what these states are proposing. You've got to be thinking about the impact. You've got to be looking at the laws, and you've got to be saying, what does that mean to me? If you are in a state where they're not specifically writing into the law what it means for employers, and remember if you were in the room, if they say you have to prove impairment, well, can you? How are you going to do that? Right? How are you going to prove? So go back to where we started in this section and say, so should I still drug test? Well, yeah, this is what's the catch-22, right? If you don't, then you're weighing your level of risk, And what can happen is then you get a negligent hiring suit or a negligence suit. They cost a lot more than the $90,000 or the $165,000, because now what you're doing is, and again, if you all are lawyers in the room, you should probably leave because I'm really doing a Reader's Digest version here. But in general, what this means is you as an employer did not take a reasonable expense to ensure safety, either to the workplace or to the public. And so you were negligent. And so the likelihood that that will cost you more is much higher. One lost negligence suit or even a significant settlement of a negligence suit can cost you more than any drug testing program you had over 5 years. And so again, as you're looking at whether you're one of those employers who has 100 employees, or you're one who has 20,000 or 50,000 or 100,000 employees, this is the risk of not drug testing. And so again, you need to be active. You need to be as active as the people who are pro-marijuana are being in your state. So what can you do? You want to define safety sensitive in your policies and in your workplace, which means you got to look at the job descriptions, which are horribly tedious to do, but you've got to do it. I challenge you that as employers, you should be working within your state to find out what the legal definition of safety sensitive is and how you can impact that. Because all these like cybersecurity issues, in many states, that would not be a defined safety sensitive position. But I do not want somebody who is taking the Gorilla Glue pot on his way in, who's in charge of all of my HR data, because when they release it, you're going to be liable, right? So they're not operating, I'm like really bad. All these years I'm bad at like the examples, right? They're not a backhoe or a whatever, nuclear something or other, right? They're not doing any of those things. But they do have all the credit card data for 2,000 or 2 million or 50 million people, and they pressed the wrong button, or maybe they had a drug habit they had to pay for and they found out a way to make some money off of it. So I challenge you to say, are you defining safety sensitive? And as you're looking at all of these laws, are you actively involved with the legislation in your states to say you had better protect me? And as the workplace evolves, we want to weigh in on how we can, as employers, define safety sensitive in our state. Because we are not maybe, all of our people may not be doing this, but there are a lot of people here who have financial responsibility, who have medical responsibility, who have responsibility for data that can cause catastrophic change, right? So we want to be able to define those as safety sensitive. And then once you do it, then you've got to look at what can you do, right? So if they're using prescription drugs, if I was taking 5 milligrams of oxycodone, and I think if you were in for Donna Smith's talk, I always like this, right? So in my mix of the 4, I've got twins who are 11. If I was prescribed 5 milligrams of oxycodone to take every 4 hours when I gave birth to those 11-year-old twins, it is still a valid prescription under the DOT. There are many days where I want to take that 5 milligrams of oxycodone to deal with those 2 twins, right? So I feel like it's valid some days. However, as an employer, if you don't address how that's happening and how you're going to handle that in your policy, then you've opened yourself up for the cost, for the issue, and for the risk. So you've got to be thinking about all of those different things. And you've got to be dealing with, like, are you going to deal with the MRO? Is the MRO able to help you with things like that for fitness for duty? Right? How are you going to do that? You've got to make this all workable. You can't make a policy, shove it in a drawer anymore, and just hope for the best. These have to be sort of like living, breathing documents that you're working with. And for all the people who say safety and HR don't have like that big fat line item of your cost versus your revenue generating, I firmly disagree. If you're doing your job well, you can be protecting and generating revenue for your company in the sense that you're not going to spend for things like this. So it's really important that you look at that, because it does work, but you can't stick it in a drawer and hope that it's the best, and the policy has been old. And when you look, your policy's old. When you look at all of these different surveys of employers saying, hey, do you have this covered? The answer is, kind of maybe, not so sure, right? So look at all the different things you have to look at. Returning to work. How long can you say to somebody you cannot reapply if you've tested positive? What do the policies look like? What are the testing for it? You got to cover all of this. And many of you say, we have it, and I think many of you may be feeling overconfident. Sorry. A lot of you are testing, but what are you testing for and who are you testing? Super important, right? And it doesn't have to be a one-size-fits all. I'm going to go out from here and go to that other room, and I'm going to talk with Frank Bernard about like designing a program. Believe it or not, I am this big of a nerd that I think it's super cool and exciting. You can design interesting programs that meet your needs. It is not one size fits all. It is not cookie cutter. You don't have to have one testing methodology. You do not have to have one rule for everyone. So who are you testing? Why are you testing? And remember, if you're not testing, guess what you're getting? All the people who were smart enough to look and see that they didn't want to go to the other people who are testing, they're coming to work for you. They always do. Pre-employment testing, I will challenge you that, well, the none is a whole other issue, right? This return to duty, follow-up periodic, that should be way higher if you are having sort of an evolved program in the era of opioid addiction and legal marijuana. That should be higher. Way higher. Pre-employment, all you're doing is getting one additional piece of data, right? You're getting one additional piece of data that says, was Nina a non-drug user? Right, that's possible. Was she smart enough to Google me to see if I do pre-employment drug testing? Was she smart enough to just stop doing the drug for this little teeny tiny window of time, right? So I don't care what you're doing, right? Whatever your technology is, you know, all of the different impairment windows tell you something different. And again, why you should be thinking all of this through. It's like a super fun game of chess if you do it well, right? So what do you want to know about the candidate? Do you want to know if they're a good fit? Do you want to know if they have good good research skills, right? Did they go out and look? Were they smart enough to look, right? Non-safety sensitive job, you can show up for an interview drunk as long as you're 21 or over. I could show up and have ripped sweatpants on and be drunk. Doesn't mean I'm not super qualified. Doesn't mean I don't know my stuff. Would you hire me? Right? I'm allowed to be drunk at the interview. My mother would say otherwise, but I am allowed to be drunk at the interview. And so, are you letting people be drunk at your interview? Or are you letting them come and be high at your interview? Like, what are you testing them for and why? And what's the purpose of it? Is it an assessment tool? If you're only doing pre-employment, you're looking at that. If you're doing pre-employment, post-accident, reasonable suspicion, well now, right, you've invested a little bit more, you're doing a little bit additional drug testing, you've invested in training your supervisors in signs and symptoms, right? You've written your policy, you've done that, you've done a little more. When you start to look at things like periodic or random, then you're starting to say, all right, I'm stepping up my game, and I'm really concerned about the cost, the risk, the liability, and safety. So you've got to look at a bunch of different things as you look at designing your program, redesigning your program. And I get that it's like hard. I get that you got a whole other job to do, but it falls into that very important but not urgent. So you look at all of these different things. You want to look at legal and regulatory issues, which we've clearly covered. You want to talk about the budget. What is your budget? That is not an unrealistic thing. Anybody who's in the room who's in sales would prefer I didn't mention that probably, but it's the reality of it. The truth is, if that's the number you start out with, but you've got an idea of why you're going to test and what you want to achieve, I guarantee you can figure it out. There are ways to figure it out. So you've got to be looking at what your budget is, and then you've got to be looking at your workplace, right? Do you have a lot of remote employees? Do you have people who are going on assignments? Are you contractors? Are you contractor screening? Do you have mandatory and safety sensitive? You have to look at that blend of your workplace, and the challenge is there is no cookie cutter, right? There are very often, one of the things we get asked most is like, what is everybody else doing? What is the best practice? I can give you those answers. DISA can give you those answers, but the challenge is they're probably not exactly like you. And so you can look at the best practices, but then you want to look at all these different things and design it differently. And you got to give yourself a little bit of time. This is not like something that you can say, you know, I'm gonna lose 10 pounds by Tuesday. You got to give yourself some time. What are the policies? And you really want to talk to your executive team. You want to talk to everybody within your sphere of influence and understand, like, go back to basics, dig back down, and try and figure out what it is you're doing and why you're testing. And then look at your policy and start to figure out what you're going to do and how you're going to redesign your program. Or if you just need a little bit of a spruce up, right? If you're just going to touch it up. And then finally, we'll go through this in the next presentation, but you got to look at all the different things. So you need the policy, and I talked a lot about policy and law. You need the policy, you need education, right? So these are the steps. You've got a list in your policy. You've got to be super specific about what behaviors are allowed and are not allowed. It cannot be generic. The up to and including thing is generally not a good thing. Okay? So we'll cover this in more detail, but you've got to define what it means. And when I talk about things like define under the influence in the policy, there's no definition, right? We don't know some of those rules for things, but you've got to be specific, and you've got to look at the laws and what the laws say and what you've got to do to define them in your policy. You got to train your employees. I can honestly say that the deterrence effect still exists, right? The deterrence effect exists in several different ways. When you know your mother is the drug testing chick and she's got a bunch of sample cups in the basement, you are likely to be slightly deterred, right? When you know your employer can call you for a random at any day, and you hear through the grapevine periodically that, like, oh, you know, Sally got pulled for a random 2 months ago, and holy cow, right? Deterrence. Doesn't mean you have to do 100% of your workplace, that'd be lovely, but you can do 10% and it has a fantastic deterrent effect, right? So educate your employees on drug use, drug abuse, what you've got for them, how you can help them, and what your requirements are and what your policy is. Same with your supervisors. Supervisors are really like the crucial piece of it. You know, I think you're high on this. Well, you just lost your lawsuit because you shouldn't have really said that because they weren't high on that specific thing, and now there's this little window, and a good lawyer is going to get right into that window. So you want to train them. Signs, abuse, documentation, consistent documentation. You should all have some great form that does all of that, so you got to do that. Employee assistance, we talked about this, and I think it's critical, and if you don't really understand it, then you should be talking to the team at DISA, you should be talking to your colleagues, you should be talking to the people in the room about what employee assistance means. And again, it's one of those line items where you're going to pay out, and then you've got to be able to say, this is the return on that investment, and this is how we're getting the return, company, by, you know, eliminating all of this training of new people and the recruiting costs and the turnover costs. That's what balances things like that. And then finally, drug testing. What are you going to test? When are you going to test? How are you going to test? Who are you going to test? You want to do all of that. And then the last thing, oh, that's me. The last thing, I guess this was the slide of my next thing, right? The last thing is you want to be active with legislation, with what's happening, with what's legal. You need to know what is up, who's funding it, what they're doing, and what it is going to cost you in both hard costs and soft costs as an employer. Because if you don't, you're going to turn around in 5 years and say, what the heck was I doing on that day when I should have been paying attention and you know, got vocal with this before it became legal in my state, and it took a long time to repeal versus to get involved before it happened. So with that, we are done. I will be out front later as well, and I'll be in the next room with Frank talking about this a little bit more.